Welcome everybody to the latest Notion AMA. We're going to be talking today with Andy Raskin. I first came across Andy when he posted an article in 2016, which went everywhere, I think, didn't it, Andy? Which was called The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen. And it brought you to my attention, and I think quite a few others in the industry. Andy has built a career around helping hundreds of founders and CEOs to align their teams around strategic stories, particularly to power success in sales, but also across marketing, fundraising, and recruiting. Perhaps you'd just like to kind of set the scene in terms of the work you do, how you help companies, and then we can take it from there in a Q&A.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here talking with you and having the opportunity to answer questions from your portfolio companies and others. Yeah, there's been this real shift, I think, over the last few years to what I'll call strategic storytelling, which is, it used to be that the story was, and I used to think about really the story was almost like a kind of wrapping paper for the product. So the product was really the thing we're building, and the story is this kind of sort of flowery, dressing for it. And what I think has happened is now CEOs are seeing this story as a strategic asset, maybe the most important strategic asset for aligning the team. And you're seeing companies like Zuora, which I wrote about in the post you mentioned, Drift, others, especially in B2B SaaS, where they're kind of centering on this story, this very customer-centric story about what's happening in the customer's world, and kind of leaving everybody else in the dust. Even other teams that might have comparable or even better product. So a few years ago, I kind of asked this simple question, like, what would it take to align a team around a simple story the way some of these companies have done? And that's really been the impetus for all the work I do, and still learning about how to do that, but definitely picked up some lessons along the way.
Could you tell us, Andy, maybe a little bit about how you approach the kind of the process of creating a strategic story, if you like, and a narrative? What's the format and process you go through?
So in my career, I had been on the receiving end of a lot of like positioning work, and often it would come in the form of something that customers would never see. So something like a positioning statement, or I don't know, some pyramid of messages, some shape, some marketing presentation. And the idea was that thing was supposed to be like the kind of guiding light, the DNA for all of the messaging that the company did. And what I found was that never actually happened. When we got done with this positioning exercise, we would have to build a sales deck or a website, and we're kind of starting from scratch again. And so when I started doing this work, I decided to go straight to the sales deck as the instrument of aligning the narrative. And I think that's been a good choice for a few reasons. One is it has all the pieces in a narrative flow. So unlike a sort of descriptive brand promise statement or something, it's got this narrative flow, like Zuora. It's got the high level, what's changing in the world, and you have to connect that very authentically to what you are actually selling, and quickly. It also is an asset we can test with customers, so we can take it out in sales calls. Is this thing resonating? And then also, finally, it's a sales first approach. So rather than the typical approach, which is often marketing or someone else is kind of creating the story and pushing it on sales, we're building this. When I work with teams, we're building the story in sales. And then once that's feeling good, then we're going to tell that everywhere. I work with teams usually over a couple of months with what I call a strategic story team. That's the CEO, led by the CEO always, and up to usually around 4 or 5 other people who are going to be not only crafting this story, but really aligning around the story. And that really, I think that second part of the aligning is often really the hard part.
We've got a first question here, which I think is kind of quite relevant to that, which is, how do you find the change when there isn't one that's apparent? Maybe you need to put that into the context of the structure that you use. And then there was a follow-up question to that as well. We can come back to
all the elements of the story that I talk about. Whose story is it? The traditional approach, which is like positioning statement, is very much about describing us and our product. It's the story, then usually our product or our company is like the main character. And the structure that I work with teams on is really about flipping that to the customer being the central character. What's happening for them? So of course, the team usually has some sense of what's changing in the world for the customer, but who might be the best person to ask about what's changing in the world for the customer? Of course, it's the customer. So always we start by talking with customers and asking them not so much like, why do they love your product, or why did they buy? Of course, that information is valuable too. But here, it's much more about what has changed in their world, over like even maybe the last 5 or 10 years, such that this product or service or whatever it is so much more valuable now, is so much more of a must-have than it would have been, even if it could have been available, say, a long time ago.
I think it's really interesting. It might be worth just kind of stepping through the kind of the framework you use. I mean, I really like that kind of concept of starting with the change, which you call, I think, the undeniable shift in the world that creates the urgency for your prospect and the big stakes, I guess, for you. Do you want to just kind of take us through those kind of five steps quickly, and then we'll get back to some more of the questions?
The 5 pieces are name the change in the world, creating stakes for customers. What is the new world that they're in? Let's show how this is creating winners and losers. So essentially the stakes. What is the new promised land? So in this new world, where do customers have to get to? What's the finish line for happily ever after? And then what are the obstacles for that, to that promised land? And we know there must be some, otherwise these customers would just sort of walk to the promised land themselves. It wouldn't be a big deal. And how are you getting them over those obstacles? And then finally, what's some evidence that you can make the story come true, which is usually customer stories.
There's an interesting one here, just to follow up from Jan, which is, okay, I guess this is talking about the whole story or the narrative. How do you know when it's done? How do you know that it, I guess, is good enough to use?
Yeah. So those are 2 questions, done and good enough. So done, never done. So like, it's like never final somehow. Like it's always even evolving just like a little bit, right? That said, I think we want to get to some version that we can commit to for, some, couple of years, maybe, at least maybe, I don't know, 6 months, 9 months, some version of that, right? The test for me is always sales. Like, are we getting the nods? Are we getting in like initial sales calls or when the CEO is giving a keynote, are we getting the people to say yes, yes, yes? And then that's creating energy and we're getting a feel for that. So this is not a, data-based A/B test. It's very much a feeling that I have to rely on, reported to me by sales teams and CEO and the rest. But I find that it's always a good indicator.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting. I think that was a really interesting, very obvious, which is in a good way, that by using the sales deck, it puts it into an environment where you're getting feedback and you're testing things. There's a second question from Simon Janicki, so HCM Hub, I think that's correct, which is about alignment, because aligning an organization is critical. And the question is, how do you align the story along with vision and mission statements? And which is the first one. There's then a bigger message, which is how do you actually align an organization around a story as well? Maybe you can kind of talk about those two.
I love this question. It's so great. And this is one of the big learnings for me, is that I used to think that my value was like helping teams structure the story. And what CEOs have like consistently reported back to me is like, actually, we could have kind of maybe done that. And actually one CEO recently said to me, this is Series D company. So he's like, I realized we needed this, but it was like a year ago. So I created it, and then I took it to my VP of sales, and he was like, yeah, this is pretty good, but I think you need to change this and this, or add this. Okay. And then he showed it to the VP marketing. Oh, that's pretty good, but maybe take away that thing the VP sales said and add it. So pretty soon it became this monster. And so the aligning was really the key to it. But this is my unpopular opinion about this. If you have the story right, I don't believe you need a mission or vision statement. First of all, I've never understood what the difference between a mission and a vision statement is. I know various people have different definitions of it. It's never been totally clear to me. And they tend to be, not always, but they tend to be self-centered. So we want to disrupt the blah, blah, blah market, or we want to be the leader in X or whatever. The way that I think about it is this story, the structure we're talking about, we've outlined this promised land, which we said is this sort of finish line to happily ever after in the new world. Isn't that the mission? Isn't that at the end of the day, getting customers to that place? So if you have the story outlined this way, you have the mission and the vision, but you have it in customer-centric terms.
I just wondering if you can just kind of give your thoughts on the importance of stories, and because I think that's a fairly kind of key thread through a lot of your work, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much now about stories. It's almost cliche. It is cliche that the storytelling is important, and a lot of people want to learn sort of storytelling as a skill for engaging with people, and I think that's totally valid and really great. What's interesting to me is the way that telling someone else's story plays in selling. And selling of, we don't have to necessarily mean selling for money, for dollars. This could be like what Dan Pink calls non-sales selling of any kind.
Andrew Davis from IDEO, in growth stage, say post-Series A and pre-Series C, how often do you see startups review and B, change their core narrative?
Certainly before Series A, there's a lot of exploration about what this narrative is, right? But I think this post-Series A, pre-C, right around here is really the sweet spot of where the company starts to really refine it. And in my experience, what happens, often I hear a very similar story from the CEOs who contact me. They say, hey, we've achieved a lot of success, but it's been, one of them described it perfectly. He said, it's been more brute force of the founders so far. And so these founders are people who are like, they're living and breathing it every day. They're in every sales call. They'll find a way to sell it. And then there's this transition that happens right in these stages. I think it happens at a different point for different companies, but to where they're going to scale up, and it's going to be new salespeople investing a lot in marketing, building out product. And there's this realization, hey, if we can really hone the story and get it right, that's going to boost the ROI of all of our investments going forward.
What is interesting when you look at somebody like Zuora, that the essence of that fundamental structure that you outlined hasn't really changed, has it?
That's right. I mean, you see the CEO not too long ago, I think a little before their IPO, very successful IPO, they had published a book called Subscribed. It's about primarily the subscription economy. It's not primarily about Zuora. In this way, I think we are really, what is Zuora selling? Of course, ultimately they're selling their software, but they're kind of acting like they're selling subscription, this is subscription mindset.
I'm going to jump into a couple of the other questions. I suppose Simon's is a good one. Key indicators of a great story.
It's sometimes hard to measure exactly like the impact of the story. It's hard to kind of control for that. But I'll tell you some of the things that I have seen where folks have measured. So one of the lowest hanging fruit, I think, is sales cycle duration. So are people getting it faster, and is it creating more urgency on the other side? This is, I would say, the thing we see the fastest, quickest. Related to that, one team called Logical, based here in San Francisco, they're in the legal space. They measure time to first win for a new sales rep. So how long does it take for someone when they come on board to close their first deal? And this, they saw this sort of slash in half when they rolled out a story along this framework. Those are some of the biggies. And then sometimes we'll have, specific goals. I just posted the other day, there's a team in Switzerland called SpotMe. They do event apps, and at least traditionally, and their vision was that, hey, maybe we could use this app not just to connect people at one event or conference, but across multiple events and conferences, like keep a community for things like employee onboarding and customer success. And so one of their big goals was closing bigger deals, that these multi-event deals. And so one of the big indicators there, we worked together last summer, and in the 2 quarters since then, they've seen the average deal size jump by 25%. So that's, and this is, the CEO tells me this is totally about them being able to sell these bigger packages underpinned by this new narrative.
You do have to put that kind of framework around it, whether it's deal size, whether it's speed, whether it's time to value, whether it's post implementation revenue expansion. There's key things that you can identify and track. So let's see, Brack, how do you get to the essence of the narrative when it feels like the sales process, product / decision seems complex? Cutting through, I guess, is the key thing there.
Yeah, well, that's what a narrative does. Ideally, that's the whole point, is can we sum this thing up in some really simple way that is sort of the gateway to getting people excited? And then once they're excited, then I think, if there's, more difficult things down the road, then maybe they're more likely to want to engage in those things. It's a little hard for me to answer that question without knowing more about specifics, but I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and then Octav, who's from a company called Paddle, during the iteration process, some customers maybe just don't see the world as you expect. They don't see the change. Does that mean is the story wrong, or is the customer just not getting it?
Yeah, so usually, basically, like I said, the kind of stage of companies we're working with, we're talking to early adopters. So we're talking to people who kind of saw it early, and the mainstream may not kind of quite see it yet. But the whole idea here is we're going to talk about this change, but we're also going to talk about how winning and losing is already playing out. So it's already here. We're not saying, hey, you should, whenever I hear the word should or you need to, this is a signal that we're not telling a story about what's happening, we're giving advice. So we have to build it so that, and this is, I see this nailing this change really as a journalistic exercise. We're looking for something that's kind of fresh, but demonstrable. Just like a journalist would look for a trend story.
I like that, fresh but demonstrable. And I think, some of the very best founders, I mean, I was fortunate to spend a couple of times meet with Teen Zhu from Zora, and he's almost mesmeric in his kind of passion for the change that he's driving. And, that the power that has across the organization is huge, isn't it? But it's also very profoundly simple, which I think is another part of it. Here's another one from Harry's company called Hazy. Do you advocate customizing the sales decks for particular customers, or is it better to hold a more general company line?
Yeah, so every team has to speak to my experience, some form of multiple audiences. So that could be different personas, it could be different industries, it could be a marketplace, it could be two sides of a marketplace. The way I like to think about it is maybe the worst thing we can do is just tell like totally separate stories for all of these groups, because then, first of all, we come off as very schizophrenic, but also we have a lot of stories to remember. And that's hard for a team. It's hard to align around many stories. So the way I think about it is that the change, it should be the glue that holds them all together. So subscription economy, the way Zuora talks about it, is the glue. And then if they're talking to, say, CFOs, they say, hey, well, in this new subscription economy, your job goes from, bean counter to business process optimizer or something. I don't know exactly what they say. But then if they're talking to a product person, they might say some different kind of shift. And so when I build the narrative with teams, we usually build one, but we build it in such a way that it has some jumping off points if we know that we're talking to a specific audience. I wrote about this in a post called Tailoring Your Pitch for Multiple Audiences. And you can see a little bit more about some examples of how I think about that.
There are a couple here which kind of tie into each other. Kind of Jan and then Simon. So Jan's was when you have a B2C product and you want to find industry partners and offer it to their customers, kind of B2B2C, who do you focus on? Customer, partner, both. And then Simon's is, our buying personas, our HR managers, but we're actually solving the problem of end users, employees. Who do we focus on?
I would say most of the cases, focusing on the change that's happening at the end user level. So usually some change in demand is the way to go. Like subscription economy is really about a change in demand. You could see it as, of course, it's enabled by lots of changes in what you might call supply, like technology and mobile phones and all the rest. But it's also, it works best as this, hey, now this is what people want. I think that's usually the way to drive it, even with partners. That said, I've seen it work the other way. Not exactly the same situation, but kind of, there's a team called Collective Health in the US that's basically sells a platform for companies to offer healthcare to their employees, very large companies. And initially, they kind of were starting out with trying to talk about a change in the way that individuals think about healthcare and what's happening there. And they found actually it was much more fruitful to start with what's happening at the company level. And so I was driving down 101 one day and there's this billboard. It says, now every CEO is in the healthcare business. And this change was one that really they were talking about at the business level, even though the end users are going to be these really essentially consumers or employees. So I've seen it work both ways.
And that would probably my one other question, which is, what have you learned that's kind of changed the way you think about the work you do over the last 2 or 3 years that's had the biggest impact on you?
One is that this really is CEO work. That the story is CEO's job. I've learned that it's going nowhere unless it really feels like the CEO is authoring this. And that's not every CEO thinks that way. And I would even go as far as to say maybe a minority of them do. That, hey, this is something that, marketing is going to work on. It's kind of that wrapping paper approach. Hey, I'm going to focus on building the company, building the product, and the story is someone else's job. I found that where this is really successful is CEOs like Tien at Zuora, like David Cancel at Drift, many others who really see this as really the core part of their job. Another one, of course, is conversations about messaging, I think, are really conversations about strategy. And this is related to that it's the CEO's job, of course. But anytime you get into this conversation about what we should be saying, you're really getting into a conversation about what our positioning is and what's our long-term approach to this whole thing. What are we doing for customers? You cannot separate the two. The last thing I learned that kind of floored me was that piece about the alignment, that the biggest value of the work that I do is this alignment piece. I used to think it was getting the story straight, and that's valuable, of course, too. But getting the whole leadership team aligned on this, I think an earlier question was, how do we get the whole organization aligned around the story? Well, I think that really starts with the leadership team being aligned first, and then moving from there.
That's a great place to end. Andy, how can people get in contact with you if they want to follow up, or they want to work with you, they want to learn more?
Best way is either you can connect with me on LinkedIn. There's also a little Drift bot on my website. You can ping me there through that as well. Yeah,
it works really well. I think that's how we started chatting, actually. So it was really effective. Look, Andy, thank you. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your time and all the experiences you've had. And lots of thank yous down here as well on the chat.
Great, and thank you to everybody who attended.